It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Crash Course International Marketing. This series of video lectures should give you a solid understanding of what you have to do and what marketing decisions you have to make when operating in international markets. I will, however, not explain marketing in general in every detail. Therefore, if you're a novice to marketing and business administration, or if you just want to brush up your marketing knowledge and skills, I strongly recommend you do the Crash Course Marketing first. And this crash course you find on my website, godberson.online. If you like to go into more detail when it comes to international marketing, I can only highly recommend the book Global Marketing, which is authored by Hollandson and Bogdanovich. This crash course, the Crash Course International Marketing, consists of 5 sections, in other words, 5 video lectures. This first section is about the framework conditions of international marketing. Then the next section will be dedicated to segmenting and selecting international markets. Furthermore, in the following sections, I will look at creating value in international markets, delivering value, and communicating value in international markets. Now, for this lecture, let's have a look at the framework conditions of international marketing. And here with this slide, I would like to start at the bottom. International marketing is not magically something completely new, and is a completely new discipline, completely separated from normal marketing or marketing in general. It is basically the same. But, and that's a very important but, you have to, when going into international markets, you have to consider the political and economic environment, the cultural conditions, and then additionally, the internal resources and competencies of your company. This means we have normal marketing. It's not magically something new, but there are 3 main factors. One would rather say, or could rather say, we have 2 main factors plus 1 additional. And the 2 main factors that we have to consider and we have to bring in into our decisions are the political and economic environment and the cultural environment of our own country, but more importantly, of the target country. And then additionally, we look at our resources and competencies. Are we fit enough, and do we have the resources to operate internationally? Let me give you a very brief introduction into marketing, and the emphasis is on very brief, as I've mentioned before. If you like to brush up on your marketing, please go to the Crash Course Marketing on my website, godberson.online. Now, what is marketing? And the most basic understanding. In a market, we have companies and customers. And the companies offer goods and services for which the customer pay by money. This exchange happens in every market. In this exchange, the companies want to maximize, at least optimize, their profits, whilst the customers want to maximize their utility. Utility is rather the language or terminology of economics. In the realm of marketing, you would probably rather say they want to gain a value out of buying and then using the goods and services they purchase. Now, this exchange process can only work if we as a company tell the customer, look at these goods and services, look at our products, and you will be lucky, you will be happy. Your luck will be overboarding if you buy and use them. So we need to communicate and tell the customer, buy your products and you will be happy. And all of this we can only do if we know who the customer is, what is of value to him, how does the customer tick, and also what is the customer willing to pay. So we need information. And that is actually what we're doing in marketing. There's nothing else. And I personally prefer such figures to understand concepts, or in this case, rather disciplines. However, if you like a written definition, you find a modern definition of marketing from the year 2025, and that is the definition of the American Marketing Association. Marketing is the activity, set of institutions and processes for creating, communicating, delivering, and exchanging offerings that have value to customers, clients, partners, and society at large. If you look at this definition and also the figure I have put on the top of the slide, one can ask him or herself, wait a minute, that is actually business administration. Yes, indeed, it is. And thus, you can understand marketing as demand-based or market-oriented business management. And I want to emphasize here, marketing is not just what you often hear in the pub, selling goods to people who do not need the goods, and the goods are overpriced, and this is the trick of marketing and such things. No, marketing is demand-based or market-oriented business management. So what are the core principles of marketing or market-oriented business management? On the figure on the top left, you can see the only condition that a market works. So remember, as I said, as a company, we want to maximize our profits. And that is what you have to do. At least you do not want to turn a loss. Of course, if you turn losses, your company will be gone sooner or later. Thus, our price, or on an aggregated level or revenue, must be higher than our cost. Only then the market works for a company. So price, or aggregated revenue, minus cost is our profit. A customer will only buy if the utility or value that he or she gets out of the product is higher than the cost the customer has. And the cost of the customer is the price of the product, plus additional transaction cost. But predominantly it's the price, and for simplicity reasons, I would like to leave it here at the price. So market only functions if our product provides the customer with a utility that is higher than the price, so that a net utility or net value results for the customer, and if the price of our product is higher than the cost. Now, very unfortunately for most managers, we're not living in monopolies, but we have competitors. So you need to look at the competitors. And in an ideal typical market, the customer will get information from all the competitors and knows what they are offering. And the customer will choose the product or the competitor with the best net utility. So with the best ratio gross utility to price. And then the customer will buy from, in this case, in this figure, competitor A, because that is a better net utility. The ratio or the difference between utility, gross utility, and price is the best. What can you do as a company to operate in markets? And what I'm showing you now, Porter's generic strategies, one might argue this approach underlies virtually every discipline of business administration. A bit of a caveat, there are different approaches like the Blue Ocean strategy, but the Blue Ocean strategy cannot be applied to every market situation or condition. So let's stick to the basics. What are Porter's generic strategies? On the one hand, you look at the market scope. Do you go into the market broadly, meaning you have large segments you want to cultivate, or in its extreme, even cover the whole market? Or do you want to go in rather narrowly and just go into a niche? The other dimension, you look at the competitive advantage, so the net utility you're providing. And there you ask yourself, where should I go? Should I be a cost leader, or should I be a quality leader? In other words, have a very unique product that differentiates from the competitors. Here with the example of air travel, so cost leader strategies, as cost leader strategy and broadly into the market, these are companies or brands like EasyJet, Ryanair, and so on. Rather on the quality side, you find airlines like British Airways, Lufthansa, Emirates. If you go into a niche, it's a very small, narrow market you're serving. An example for differentiation strategy in a niche might be a private jet charter. There are not too many who can afford this, so it is a niche market. And a bit made up example for low cost strategy is hobby pilot hitchhiking. Just think of a hobby pilot who flies from London to Manchester and he says, just for fun, as his hobby. He says or offers to someone to come with him for 10 quid or 20 quid for the flight. So, and this is basically very much simplified. Of course, there's more to it, but this is basically what you do in business administration and more specifically in marketing. Now, what is the marketing process? Again, one can make it more complex, but keep it simple and strong. What we're doing in marketing, we're analyzing our market. In other words, we're segmenting the market, building different market segments, or if you will, sub-markets. And then we're targeting, meaning selecting the markets we would like to cultivate. We know then these are our markets, these are our potential customers, so we need to position and managing our brands we want to bring to the hearts and minds, and then also to our customers, physically speaking. And positioning, managing brands we do by creating value, delivering value, and communicating value. You can also bring the 4 P's of the traditional marketing mix into this. Creating value consists of the 2 P's, product and price. Delivering value is place, the distribution of our goods and services. And communicating value is promotion, so marketing, communication, and personal sales. Another perspective of what we're doing in business administration is the value chain. Here again, simplified, you can have things more complicated, but keep it simple and strong is never a bad idea. So what are we doing when we have a business? We have to do some research and development to come up with great products. We have to produce these products. Then we need to communicate these products to our target group and establish a distribution system. Finally, it's sales. We need to sell our products, and typically we need to provide additional services. And one can say that research and development are rather upstream operations, using the analogy of a river, whilst communication, sales and services are rather downstream operations. That is marketing in a nutshell, if you will. Now let's look at the factors that are influencing marketing and our marketing decision in international markets. As I've mentioned before, it is the political and economic environment. Here we should look at our home country's environment, potentially at third countries, possibly more important, as we probably have a good idea how our home country works. So more effort has to put into the target country's environment to analyze, understand, and draw conclusions out of the target country environment. And then, as the last two steps, on the basis of the aforementioned analysis and information, we need to evaluate and later realize our business opportunities and simultaneously assess and possibly mitigate the risk we are facing. First, let's look at the home and third country environment. The main two perspectives, again, there might be more, but the main two perspectives are looking at information and promotional support and trade restrictions, for instance, embargoes or sanctions. And if you're coming from a developed country or highly developed country, you get quite good information, at least at the basic level. And you have governmental risk assessments, you have chambers of commerce, and so forth. To give you two examples, His Majesty's Commonwealth and Foreign Office, or Foreign and Commonwealth Office, offers an analysis of the business risk for every country on the planet. If you have not really an idea how a country looks like and you want to have a basic understanding, and in fact it's not a basic understanding, it goes rather deep, our good friends from the CIA provide you with a CIA fact book. And they're very good information that you know what's the history of a country, all the data that you have in the country like GDP, inhabitants, language spoken, religions, and so forth. Of course, you have to go deeper and find information and sources that are more specific to your business, but the CIA fact book is a very good starting point. Now also, it's not the worst of ideas to follow geopolitical developments. For instance, since 2022, there's a war in Ukraine, and amongst others, the United Kingdom and the European Union were not quite happy with this, so they placed sanctions on Russia. Meaning, if Russia was a great place for you before 2022 to conduct business in, now probably it's not the best idea if you are from the UK or the European Union to do business with Russia, as these two entities put Russia under sanctions. Let's go to the target country environment. As I said earlier, probably here you have to put substantially more effort in than understanding your home or third country environment. Now, with a target country environment, you should look at the political system, judiciary, and the safety situation, and then rather on the economic side, the economic system, trade barriers, and economic development of the country. Start with the political system. The two main points from my perspective are, do we have a rather democratic or rather autocratic system? Do we have a rather stable or unstable political system? And I think the examples I'm giving you here make this quite clear. If you look at Switzerland, one could say some sort of a role model democracy. It's a bit different situation than you find in North Korea, a country which is in the firm grip of one fellow and his family. And the stability. Switzerland is very stable, whilst I can only advise against having your next relaxing holidays in Sudan. It's rather an unstable country and not the safest of countries, at least at the time of this recording in 2025. Secondly, look at the judiciary and the safety situation. Do you have an independent and strong, or do you have a dependent and weak judiciary? Again, if I had to choose where to stand trial, I would rather choose Switzerland than North Korea. In North Korea, you might get the arbitrary sentence that you are a spy, even though you haven't done anything. So better go to Switzerland than to North Korea, if you're coming from a Western country at least. Also, do not forget the safety situation. Some cities are rather safe. For instance, Zurich. I don't think there's any problem taking any taxi that just passes by. You won't have a problem with Zurich. However, I've been given to understand it's a better idea that when in Rio de Janeiro, to only get a taxi, this is called by your hotel, that stops in front of the hotel and you verify, all right, you are the taxi I've called. Otherwise, you might find yourself in the very unfortunate, uncomfortable position that you wake up as a body the next day and a few organs are missing. Let's look at the economic system. And again, I hope I could make this clear beforehand. It's rather gradual than categorical than when looking at a free market economy and a centrally planned economy, or looking at price controls versus no price controls. There's rather more or less, rather than one or the other. And looking at labor restrictions, or no labor restrictions, low tax, high tax, non-corruption versus a very corrupt system. For going international, all the first mentioned characteristics, this is what we want to see. Centrally planned economy normally is not great. A completely controlled market, not great. From a company perspective, not from a moral perspective, from a company perspective, labor restrictions, these are not our friends. High taxes, very nasty, and corruption, that doesn't make life easier. And look at a few countries. So, just compare Germany and the United States. So Germany is by no means a socialist country, but you have price controls and interventions from the government. For instance, the healthcare sector or the housing sector. In the US, these interventions are weaker. The same applies to labor restrictions. You have very strong workers' protection in Germany and laws, labor protection laws, very much in the favor of employees. And then to compare Germany and Ireland. Germany, I believe, at the moment has a corporate income tax of 30%, whilst the Irish income tax, corporate income tax, I must say, is 12.5%. 12.5% to 30%, that makes a difference. And again, if you work or if you operate internationally, it is very much a difference if you are in the US, Germany, or Ireland, or some normally least developed country where corruption is part of how one does business there. Now, trade barriers. You look at tariffs, quotas, and local content requirements. Of course, again, what is beneficial to us as an internationally active company is no tariffs, no quotas, no local content requirements. And that example that I'm giving you probably makes this clear. A business model for the automotive industry. Of course, other industries too. Well, here I'm taking the example of the automotive industry. So German companies, Japanese companies, and so forth. They are the United States, arguably the most lucrative market in the world, where everybody wants to make business. That is the largest economy with a very, very strong, one of the highest purchasing powers in the world. So we want to make business in the US as an automotive company. Unfortunately, the labor costs are rather high in the US. So we find a way around this. And the way around is we're producing our cars in Mexico. And until recently, there was the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, the US, and Canada, which means we can produce our cars at a lower cost, or relatively low cost, ship them over the border to the US and sell them there. Now, from the perspective of an internationally, a German or Japanese car manufacturer, internationally operating car manufacturer, in 2025, the tariff policies of the Trump administration are not our friend. As with the tariffs, this business model is at risk. Perhaps we have to go down with our price because the importer in the United States has to pay the tariffs in form of a tax. Or our products, because of the tariffs, get more expensive in the US, the price rises, and we can sell less. Or in total, we have a combination of lots of things. The margin, the profit margin we can make, goes down. So here, trade barriers not our friend, and we need to understand them and analyze them. Finally, within the category of target country environment, we have the economic development of our target countries. Now, what you normally look at with a first view is what countries do we actually target? Is this highly developed countries, developing countries, or less developed countries? When I was younger, it was called the first world, the second world, and the third world. You can also, because this normally correlates, call high developed countries high income countries, developing countries medium income countries, and less developed countries low income countries. And here I have brought some examples. Normally, one would consider Germany and Switzerland high income or highly developed countries, China and India developing countries, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Malawi less developed countries and low income countries. In this context, you can look at the GDP, the gross domestic product, which is the output that a country has. So what does a country produce? The GDP has a few weaknesses, but it's a good enough indicator. It would be too far. It's a rather economics topic to discuss what are the weaknesses of the GDP and what are a bit of the hurdles when interpreting this. However, you can see that Germany, for instance, here has a GDP of more than $4.5 trillion US, while Switzerland has less than $1 trillion. At first glance, one would say Germany is a larger market. Let's go there, forget about Switzerland. But do not only look at the GDP, the total GDP, also have a look at the GDP per capita. So what is one person in the country producing? Now we have a quite different story when looking at Germany and Switzerland. The GDP per capita in Germany is just shy of $56,000, whilst the Swiss GDP per capita exceeds $100,000. So, whilst Germany is a larger market, the Swiss individually have a higher purchasing power. And perhaps a very stupid example here, if you sell, as we're now with Switzerland, if you sell luxury Swiss watches, Germany and Switzerland, that might be a good market. You also find quite a few customers in China, and to a certain degree in India, as it's just such a large economy, even though, on average, they're substantially poorer than the Germans and the Swiss. But your market in Congo and Malawi, with a GDP per capita of $647 and $508, probably your market is not the largest there. Of course, for Swiss luxury watches. Based on this analysis, home country and especially target country environment, you draw your conclusions and evaluate the business opportunities as well as the risk and see what mitigation measures can we take if a risk occurs. With regard to the business opportunities, it all goes to or leads to how much money can we make. So what is the amount of revenue and eventually profit that we can make in this target country? But do not look, whoa, what is the money we can make? Also look, is this profit, this revenue and profit we can achieve, is this sustainable? So is it stable in the long run? When looking at risk, you predominantly look at ownership risk. Can our company or subsidiary in the target country be nationalized? And operating risk. Do we have corruption? Do we need to fear for our lives even? And so forth. How to do this? In a simplified 3-step process. You firstly assess your home and your target country environment. Furthermore, you assess possible political and societal events or developments. Then you deduce the impact on your business from the current situation and from potential changes. And on this basis, you select your target countries. That's a good country to go in, that is not, and that is perhaps a maybe. You develop, of course, market strategies and operations, and you should also develop risk mitigation measures. That was the political and economic environment. Let's head on to the cultural environment. You can say the political and economic environment is the hard facts, the cultural environment is the soft facts. Very important here is to define a culture, because we often in our daily lives use the term culture very loosely. In social sciences, culture is defined as the norms and values which are learned from a group, my upbringing, my family, my friends, wherever I live. So there's the norms and values are socially learned, normally through my process of socialization. And then they're also shared with a group of people. And these shared norms and values lead to this group, the group that shares these norms and values, showing similar behaviors. And through this definition, it probably becomes already apparent that culture has an overt dimension, which is behavioral patterns, and a covert dimension, which is the norms and values, and one could even say even more deeply rooted fundamental cultural values. So you have the clothing, the body language, the lifestyle. Do you shake hands? And such things as behavioral patterns. The social norms. What is of importance to me? Is it just my spouse and my family or my close friends? Or is it my wider family, the company I'm in, the entire society? What are gender roles? Are men and women seen as equals? Or is there a hierarchy that one or the other is seen as superior? And so forth. On the rather fundamental cultural level, you can see that religion, national identity, or ethnic identity form the values there. Perhaps giving you a very simple example, they can see how the values or how the cultures differ. So a few years back, I was traveling forth and back between the United Kingdom, between England to be precise, and Germany. And within a week, I was in England, and a lady asked me, how or why is it that all the German women dress like men? And then a few days later, I was in a pub in Germany, and some fellow there got wind that I'm just over from England and asked me, England is absolutely great. I was out at the weekend and all the girls were dressed like hookers. So of course it's not this extreme, but I hope I could exemplify that the body language, the clothing. It's quite different when you're going out on a Saturday night in England and in Germany. And underneath, this is because underneath there are different norms and values. Now, to make matters a bit more complex, culture is not just the culture of the United Kingdom, the culture of Germany, the culture of the United States. No, culture has several layers. We normally have a national culture. At the moment, you might say, in the Western world at least, we do not have a culture in the sense of shared values shared by nearly everyone, what the Americans describe as culture wars. But we used to have, and I'm very confident we will come back to a national culture in the Western countries. But within these countries, you have subcultures. Might be regionally, they're different, there's ethnic influences. In an industry even, the culture at work or in a company, they have subcultures there. And the national culture, through the subcultures, have an impact on the individual behavior. These layers of culture I would like to exemplify in two ways, or using two examples. Let's have a look at the United States. What can have an influence on culture? The region where I'm living, the religion, ethnicity, occupation, social stratum, and so forth. Of course, I'm oversimplifying here, so don't grill me. I just want to make the point. So, an investment banker in New York City is very much different than a guy from Texas with a cowboy mentality. And again, he is very much different than some sort of a surfer dude from California. As I said, that's very much simplified, but I think you get my point that depending on in which region you're living in the United States, you possibly and most likely have a slightly different set of norms and values than your fellow Americans from another region. But that is not only the US, it's also the United Kingdom. Of course, there is, or at least there was, a unified UK culture, norms and values that everyone, virtually everyone, had in the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom consists of 4 nations: England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And these 4 nations have their own traditions, their own norms. They might not be light years away from each other, but they have their own cultural identity. And as a tip for normal life, if you ever go to Scotland, don't tell a Scotsman that he is English. That is not the best of ideas. He's still Scottish and not English. The same applies to the rest of the 4 nations. Now, I hope I could give you an idea what culture is and what layers of culture you have. And with all the complexity I possibly have shown here, it is a good idea that I show you 2 approaches which can serve as a framework to get around culture, analyze and understand culture. Of course, it's not sufficient to just go with the 2 frameworks I'm showing you in a moment. You have to go a step deeper, but they can give you a structure and are a very good approach to analyze culture and understand it. The first approach is the differentiation between low context and high context cultures. Again, that's rather gradual than categorical. Typical low context culture is Germany. High context cultures you find in the Far East, in the Middle East, and so on. And the differentiation, low context to high context culture, comes from: is the social context of importance? In low context culture, it's not so important. In high context culture, the social context, the relationships are relatively highly important. Let's look at a low context culture like Germany first. Germany and other low context cultures have a rather individualistic orientation. What is important is I am important, and my nuclear family, my spouse and my children, and perhaps my best friends I'm watching the rugby with. Oh, I believe the Germans are rather watching the football. In low context culture, a hierarchy is rather challenged. And surprisingly enough, most democracies across the world, you would rather say these are rather low context cultures. So we do in low context cultures where it's very unlikely that we accept an autocratic ruler or a ruling class or something like this. Also in the business world, it is not to every extent, but it is accepted that an employee challenges the position of his or her superior. Not to the fullest of extents, but to a certain extent. Low context cultures are oriented toward results, sort of in the way 1980s style in Top Gun, second place is the first loser, to simplify this a bit. Time is understood as being exact. So you should be punctual. So don't be late in Germany. And especially, I spent some time in Switzerland. You should not be late there. It is an understanding of time as some sort of resource. I invest my time to get some result out. So therefore, time is money, is a common Western saying. And messages are quite clear, quite direct, as explicit messages. In a very high context culture, the people mean what they say. In contrast, in a very low context culture, in contrast, in a high context culture, there's a rather collectivistic orientation. The focus is not solely on me and my nuclear family, it's the wider family and the larger social group. There's my uncles, my aunts, my second cousin, and so forth, and also the wider group up to the whole nation is of more importance. Typically, people in high context cultures accept hierarchy. So, quite often, autocratic systems are at the same time high context cultures. And in such cultures, you normally do not disagree with your superior. It is what is seen as rather important in high context culture is the relationship. High context culture, of course, they want to achieve something. That goes without saying, but at the same time, what is more important is to maintain good relationships, not to offend someone else, but to be on good terms. In this context, time is rather seen as building and living relationships. And with this, time is rather flexible. Punctuality is not the strong side of most high context cultures. In this context, messages are not too direct. Again, you do not want to offend someone. Messages are rather implicit and indirect. On the bottom, on the spectrum, you see a few countries from low context to high context cultures. So Switzerland, Germany, very much low context cultures, and as I've mentioned before, Middle Eastern countries and Japan, very much high context cultures. But even within one continent, you might find quite some differences. And I think an example, again, it is an example, and perhaps slightly oversimplifying, can make this clear. Look at Europe, and you have Germany and Spain. And think of eating, having a dinner. In Germany, people sit down and they have their food in front of them. It takes 15 minutes, food is done, and they get up from the table. Think of the tapas in Spain. The actual process of eating is 15 minutes, as it is in Germany. But if you go for proper tapas in Spain, you spend 2-3 hours. And it's rather a social gathering or social event than eating as it is with the stereotypically highly efficient Germans. So you see, two highly developed countries on the same continent have different norms and values, which show themselves in their behavior, as the example of having dinner hopefully could show. Now, the second approach, second framework I would like to introduce you to is the Hofstede model. And the Hofstede model has 6 dimensions. I will give you the example of the UK and China in a moment to make this clear. Firstly, I would like to define the dimensions. On each dimension, you got a score from 0 to 100, and the higher the score, the more or the stronger the dimension is in this culture. So the first dimension is power distance. Power distance describes how much the people within this culture accept an unequal distribution of power. For instance, do I accept that I live in an autocratic system, or don't I accept this? Individualism versus collectivism, very similar as what I've just described. Individualistic cultures look on themselves individually and the nuclear family plus a few close friends, whilst collectivistic cultures have a stronger focus on the larger groups, wider family, company, possibly even the whole nation, or some countries the tribe they belong to, and so forth. And with that, the loyalties goes. In an individualistic country, my loyalty goes primarily with my nuclear family and my close friends. In a collectivistic country, there's a stronger loyalty placed on the wider family and larger groups. The next dimension is motivation towards achievement and success. And here you can distinguish between high scores say it's rather decisive culture, low scores say it is rather a consensus-oriented culture. Decisive cultures want competition, they want success, want to be the best. The Top Gun example I've just mentioned. Second place is the first loser. That is a hardcore decisive culture. Consensus-oriented cultures is rather getting along, liking one another, and liking what I'm doing. So that is rather driven by harmony and consensus and a good quality of life. Cultures might also differ with regard to uncertainty avoidance. Am I fine with the unpredictable ambiguity of our world now and the future? Or do I want, if I have very high scoring, and if a culture scores very highly on the dimension of uncertainty avoidance, am I not fine with this? Do I see unpredictability and ambiguity as something bad? And do I want to take attempts in advance to mitigate these uncertainties? The next dimension is long-term orientation. And here cultures that look at a strong past, along a strong past normally, have a long-term orientation, and they are open to new and pragmatic approaches to tackle the present and future challenges. Low scores on this dimension indicate normative cultures who are very adamant to change and see everything new with suspicion, and they would like to have simple old traditional norms. Finally, indulgence versus restraint. High scores on this dimension mean we're happy to show our emotions and our impulses and desires, whilst in restrained cultures, people control the open expression of their impulses and desires. To make this a bit more clear, I hope, here is the scores for the United Kingdom and China. UK's navy, whilst China is in the maroon color. Power distance. That makes very much sense. The UK scores very low, whilst China has 80. UK is a democracy with a long tradition, whilst China Yeah, it's not a democracy, at least not by Western standards. A very hierarchical system where the Communist Party and the influential people in the Communist Party decide what happens. Similarly, individualism. The United Kingdom, as a Western country, places a high emphasis and value on an individualistic lifestyle. I am important, and my nuclear family, and perhaps my close friends are important. Whilst China, as a collectivistic culture, there the overall society plays a higher value. Finally, to make this clear, the last dimension, indulgence versus restraint. In the UK, I mentioned this already, if you're going out on the weekend, you will be surprised what you see in the UK. At least in some places, people are freely showing what they want and how they feel. In China, probably, if you look at the past and the history of China, it was not a good idea during the Cultural Revolution or other periods to show your emotions and your true self. You are a bit more restrained, which was, at least in the past, quite good for survival. Now, the two main factors influencing marketing and which have to be taken into consideration when making marketing decisions, political and economic environment as well as cultural environment, I've just introduced. The additional factor is the resources and competencies of the company that wants to go international. And here you have three guiding questions that you have to ask yourself on a more general level. Do the customer value of our product and therewith our competitive advantage and the scope of business model, are we going to the niche or mass market, meet the needs and wants as well as the economic, political and cultural environment of international markets? So we need to ask ourselves if the normal marketing analysis, or we conduct a normal marketing analysis, if you will, is a product okay for this market? Do we have a competitive advantage? Can we go with a low cost or a product uniqueness strategy? For this, how do we have to go into the international markets, and do we have the competencies and the money for this? That is in fact the second question. Do we have the international business experience, the competencies, perhaps the contacts and other means to create, deliver and communicate a convincing customer value of our product to international markets? And as I said before, do we have the financial resources? It's a difference if a huge company like HSBC, British Airways, Apple, Amazon, if they operate internationally, or if a down-to-earth, medium-sized company with 100 or 200 employees goes international. I think it's quite obvious who normally has the better financial resources. Now, finally, as I've said before, I invite you and also recommend understand international marketing as normal marketing. It's the same stuff you're doing in domestic marketing, with the exception that you have to factor in the political and economic environment, the cultural conditions, and our resources. And then look at domestic versus international marketing. I've introduced you before to the basic marketing operations or process. We're segmenting and targeting markets. We're positioning our brands through creating value, delivering value, and communicating value. These basic or normal, if you will, marketing operations or processes, we have to adjust according to political and economic environment, the cultural environment, and the resources and competencies of our company. So in general, our guiding questions when operating internationally are: Should we go and do this? By the way, there's no shame not being in international markets, as if you're successful at home and there's no opportunity going international. Why would you do this? Then continue doing your successful business at home. But if you decide, yes, it's a good idea to go international, how should we do this? That is what you need to answer. How should we operate internationally? And your main question there is, how much do we need to adjust our product and our business model to international markets? How much can we standardize? And that is one of the main questions in international marketing or in international business. Ideally, we want to have a standardized approach so that we can go with our product that we have at the moment in the same way, with the same product, the same other marketing processes into all markets in the world. That makes our life much easier. It saves cost. But that is virtually never the case. So we have to ask ourselves, how much do we have to localize our product, our marketing communication, our distribution, our pricing, and so forth, to meet the hard facts environment and possibly and arguably more important, the cultural specifics of our target market. So generally speaking, you want to standardize in international marketing business. You want to standardize as much as possible to keep your operations simple and save cost. And you must localize as much as necessary. These were the framework conditions of international marketing. In the next video lecture, I will go deeper into how to analyze, in other words, segment, and then select international markets. Until then, I wish you all the best, and it is bye-bye for now.